Eric. Hello, everyone. We're just going to give it a few minutes for everybody to join. Thank you all for joining us today. So we will get started in a few minutes. Hello, everyone. Still waiting a few minutes for everybody to join. Good morning, everybody who's taking advantage of the chat feature. We're going to give it one more minute to get started. We've got people checking in from everywhere: Georgia, New York, Berks County, North Carolina, and a hello from Philly, DC, Arizona. Thank you all for joining us today. So we will get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Lush. I am the Regional Resource Director for Philadelphia and Delaware at Caron Treatment Centers. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the topic, When Success Leads to Failure, Substance Use Disorder Among High-Achieving Legal Professionals. As a reminder, we will be conducting this session in webinar format, meaning all participants' microphones will be muted and we are unable to see or hear you. During the presentation, please utilize the Q&A or chat feature to ask any questions. Depending on the volume of questions, if we can't get to your question before the end of the hour, we will have someone from our team follow up with you directly. Today's presentation is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. We would like to thank our educational partner, CE Learning Systems, for assisting in providing these credits through our co-sponsorship with the American Psychological Association. Please note that in order to receive your credits, you will need to complete the post-webinar evaluation. A link will be emailed to you directly after the presentation from cego.com. After finishing the evaluation, you will have immediate access to your certificate of completion. Today, I am proud to introduce our presenter, Eric Weber. Eric is the Program Director for the Legal Professionals Program and Senior Clinician for Specialty Services at Caron. He provides direct care through specialty lectures and counseling sessions focused on relapse, addiction interaction disorders, work and professional related issues, and other targeted needs. Since 2007, Eric has been a clinician at Caron, working with adult primary and relapse patients, as well as focusing on the needs of attorneys, executives, and other professionals as they enter recovery. He has served as clinical supervisor for the men's primary unit and the director of the men's relapse unit, as well as the senior clinical advisor to the executive unit. Eric is certified alcohol and drug counselor and certified clinical supervisor, and also holds a certificate of competency in problem gambling, all through the Pennsylvania Certification Board. He is also a certified sex addiction therapist and certified multiple addiction therapist through the International Institute for Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Eric earned his bachelor's from Kutztown University and his master's at Alvernia University in Reading. I will now hand the presentation over to Eric Weber to get us started. Thank you for joining us today, Eric.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it. So what Adam didn't mention is I also play in a rock band. So, all those certifications, sex, drugs, and rock and roll is kind of what I do. So today I'm happy to be talking about legal professionals. As mentioned, I am the director of the legal professionals program here at Cairn. So we get an opportunity to work with attorneys, judges, law students, anybody who's gone through law school. And we started this program a number of years ago, recognizing that folks who go through law school and engage in a legal profession tend to have some unique issues that need to be addressed. And so we started a professional program, professional track specifically for them. And just want to share a few things with you today, kind of give you an idea of what it's like working with folks who are legal pros who are really high achieving, because it's difficult a lot of times for a high achieving professional, whether legal or not, to recognize powerlessness and unmanageability as they're going through the treatment experience. So our objectives today, I won't bore you with reading all of these, but we're going to identify some alcohol rates, refer to some specific studies, look at some ethical rules from the ABA, American Bar Association, look at some attorneys' difficulties with work-life balance, and discuss a little bit about resiliency. So the fact is that probably across the board, I think it's a safe general statement to say that lawyers are under a great deal of pressure. And that's not to say that other professions aren't. I think we all are in our profession as well. But lawyers have a particular type of pressure that they're dealing with. And the fact is that they're going to receive very little training on how to handle this stress. For the most part, law school is a very competitive atmosphere. The training is, suck it up, buttercup, and study harder, and have a couple of beers at the end of the day with your chums and move on and get on to the next class. Oh, by the way, you've got to get ready to pass the bar after 3 years or 4 years. For many folks in I think ubiquitous in the atmosphere at law school and, in many law firms, the decompressing, it really translates into drinking. And it's the norm. It's acceptable, and it's perpetuated. And so what we're looking at is question, is it possible to get a copy of these slides? Yes, Anna. The question is, how do we start to treat this when it's so soaked into the environment that these folks, are in? So, part of what makes the legal profession so incredibly stressful is that for many attorneys, they tend to internalize people's setbacks and problems. The fact is that you don't go see an attorney when everything is going right. You go see an attorney when everything is going wrong. And I joke with my patients. I'm like, yeah, we're kind of in the same boat. People don't come see me when their life is really great. People come see me when their life is in the garbage can and they've got no place else to go. Better go to inpatient treatment. And so as in the helping profession, we do tend to take on people's setbacks, their problems. And attorneys' jobs typically is to solve that problem. And they do a really good job of it, or they try and do a really good job of it. And most of the attorneys I work with do internalize this because it's part of their self-worth, part of their identity, that they're dealing with this, that they're doing a great job. And so there is a serious internalization. And if they're internalizing that, there's very little methods, very little ability to cope with it at the end of the day, as we just talked about. An attorney friend of mine, a guy I work with very closely, Corey Rabin, this next point, he makes this very clearly, that rarely is everybody happy at the end of the case. And it's funny, I'm working with criminal defense attorneys, and they'll say, look, I'll get somebody from a 10-year sentence down to a 2-year sentence, and they're still bitching at me that it's a 2-year sentence. And he says, hey, look, I just saved you 8 years of your life. But the fact is that a lot of times people are not happy at the end of a case. I just had a transactional attorney who joked that true compromise is where everybody's slightly disgruntled at the end of it. Okay, that's an interesting way to look at it. But it's very difficult to make everybody happy, if not impossible, everybody happy at the end of whatever that case may be. Let's skip down to the bottom, that lawyers tend to bottle up emotions and do not connect or ask for help. And I think this is started in law school when it is an incredibly competitive atmosphere. And that, you start with even if it's collegial, sort of an adversarial standpoint in all of your dealings. I have a friend of mine who's teaching at Drexel Law. He's teaching a course there. And the first semester he taught, he said, Eric, I'm really struggling because I can't give everybody an A. I'm expected to grade on a curve. There are some people that will not get an A, even if I feel like they've all done a great job. And so we're in an atmosphere in law school where, you're not going to show a lot of emotion. You're going to be put under the gun, and things aren't fair. And if you tend to let that emotion out, it may not be viewed upon really well. And so there is this tendency to bottle it up, and as I said earlier, suck it up, buttercup, and move forward. And asking for help is very rare. We do have some instances in certain law schools where they're starting to look at wellness and mindfulness and starting to look at the overall well-being of lawyers, young lawyers getting into the field. University of Miami, and there's a couple of others that are doing a wellness program that are starting to get a little better at this and helping the students ask for help when they start to struggle. So I do want to put that out there, that we are making some progress, although it's kind of slow at this point. So, the fact is that, chronic stress and anxiety is going to result in burnout, other negative conditions, that being addiction, depression, just sad, hard family life. And these things are very difficult to reverse. And a couple of slides, we're going to, get into some data, taking a look at the percentage of attorneys who are struggling with depression, anxiety, and the fact that it's greater than the general population. And part of this is going back up that lawyers typically don't take criticism well and can be defensive. Even constructive criticism can be a struggle. Again, folks coming from a very competitive academic background and then into an adversarial or competitive work life, criticism can be quite staggering. And so, folks may not, when they do get that criticism or that constructive feedback, may turn to more self-destructive ways to deal with it at the end of the day, i.e. back to drinking. There's a perfectionism that we're going to find in the legal field, and unrealistic expectations. And the fact is, I need to win everything for everybody, and that's not realistic. Everybody's going to lose a case here or there. Everybody's going to have a deal that's going to go south. Everybody's going to have a compromise that's not going to feel like it's really equitable. But there is a certain amount of perfectionism. And I think this gets perpetuated, A, internally by the people who get into the field, but also B, from the folks that need attorneys and say, look, I need this perfect. If we're working on a contract and it's 100 pages of contract and one little punctuation point is going to, mess the whole thing up, that whoever's going through this says, you know what, this needs to be perfect. If I'm the managing partner or the partner in charge of this deal and I hand it to my associate, I say, here, I want you to go through and I want you to write this up, and I get it back and there's mistakes, probably not going to be really happy with that associate. And then that just gets perpetuated both up and down the food chain, that perfectionism is the expectation, despite it being fairly unrealistic. There is a certain social alienation, and it's funny. It's notable, not funny. It's kind of sad, actually. Social alienation is attorneys have a nickname. We call them sharks. That's not a pleasant expression for folks who are trying to be helpers, but yet that is the nickname of the profession. Why is that? Because, they hunt, they eat, they kill, they're considered kind of cold. That's not a great way to feel about oneself in society. There is, I think it was Shakespeare? No. Somebody wrote the joke, what do you call 100 lawyers at the bottom of the ocean? A good start. I don't know how many times I've heard that joke. If you've heard that joke, yeah, that's out there. If you've not, that's a pretty popular joke. And it's pretty sad that we have that and everybody knows about it, right? So there is this social alienation, that people don't like lawyers until they need one. And attorneys know that. Attorneys are very, very keen on that. If I'm sitting in group and I say, yeah, what do you do for a living? Oh, I'm an attorney. Or somebody makes an attorney joke. We laugh about it, but there is a certain amount of ostracizing that's going on, that social alienation that people might tend to internalize. The tendency to be pessimists Skeptics viewing bad events as unchangeable. Again, attorneys see situations at their worst, people at their worst, and have to be able to deal with um, situations that do do perpetuate pessimist and skeptic views, right? And I appreciate this. For a lifetime ago, I worked in corrections. I worked in the county jail, and you tend to see when you tend to see that much of the not great part of humanity, you tend to be a bit of a pessimist and a skeptic. You can't help it; it just sort of soaks in. So, I can't blame folks for that, but it is important when we take a look at trying to help attorneys get to a point of healthiness and wellness, that we recognize this piece and try and work with it. All right. The pressures and the workload, and anybody who works in big law will really understand. That's why I take big law, private sole practitioners as well. I know a lot of times the sole practitioners I'm working with here in inpatient treatment really struggling because if they're not working, they're not making money. For big law, it's just lots of work coming down the line. And to quote somebody who recently said, "Look, the organization will take whatever you're willing to give, and it's not going to apologize, and it's not going to care about how you feel about it. It's just going to take whatever you have to give." And so the workload can be brutal. The competition to advance is fierce. And the work can be very adversarial. It can be collegial at times as well. I don't want to say that it's always adversarial. I've worked with a number of attorneys who say, look, within my practice group, we're very collegial, or within my particular office, we're very collegial. But there's always that adversarial piece of I've got to write the contract, or I've got to go to court, or I've got to prove my case, which means I'm trying to be right and somebody else is trying to be wrong, or I'm trying to get as much of the pie from my client as possible, which means I'm taking it from somebody else. And that can wear on somebody. Or it can start to have detrimental effects at home if somebody's not able to shed that once they walk in the door in the domestic situation. So lawyers tend to like intellectual challenges, but the combative demands might be at odds with somebody who says, look, I'm really not that combative at my core. I recently had a patient maybe 6 months ago who was a public defender. And she said, Eric, I hate being in court. I'm tired of fighting the fight. I want to do transactional law. I want to write contracts. I just want to put deals together and hand them over. And so the combative demands of being a public defender really were at odds with her particular nature. And I had a lot of compassion for her. And we talked about how to transition to something that would be less adversarial and combative. Because sometimes attorneys find themselves in a particular work group or particular area of law that's not as conducive to their personality as they'd like. It's not a case where the lawyers come out and go, you know what, I want to get in this area and this is what I'm going to do. A lot of my lawyers say, I kind of fell into it, or this was what was open at the firm, or this is what they were hiring for. A lot of my attorneys say, why did I get into this area? Because somebody was going to pay me to do it. That's why. First year at a law school, I will go wherever somebody has a job. Everybody's paranoid about not getting a job. So people do get stuck in areas of practice that may be not their first or even second choice, and maybe a bit of a struggle with their personality. And as we're working with them, and we'll get to this at the very end, we start talking about career counseling. I've counseled a number of attorneys on how to start to make a shift to another area of practice, or even out of the practice of law, because it just didn't turn out to be a really good fit. But we'll get into that a little further down the line. Last point, I think we've talked about, a bit that, lawyers don't want to let anybody down. They're very much looking to have that perfectionism, to feel good about what they're doing for their clients, and that makes them feel good about themselves. And then there's also the rewards, both monetarily and others, reputation and whatnot, that sense of identity that they do a great job. And that gets very, very much ingrained in them. All right. And again, my partner put this in here. Yet experience teaches that not everything can be anticipated. And my partner, Corey, he's been an attorney, I think, for 35 years now. He's got some great stories about that, about things he didn't anticipate. If he was here, I'd cut him loose for some good stories. All right. We talked about this a little bit. Personal values and ethics are often challenged. And and especially in some of the more adversarial roles that somebody might find themselves. If you're working with criminal defense attorneys, there has to be a hard ethical box within which they practice of this person, even if they're guilty of sin, deserves the best defense. That's what they are. They're constitutionally guaranteed. That's what I have an ethical obligation to give them the best defense, even if, the offense that we're talking about can be incredibly personally offensive. And so a lot of the criminal defense lawyers that I work with really have to have a bit of a strong compartmentalization, ability to compartmentalize, because they don't want to take that stuff home with them, or they don't want to think about, gee, this person got accused of this particular crime, and if that happened to my family member, I'd be really upset. That can be very, very challenging to somebody's personal values. And again, if somebody has got a strong ability for compartmentalization, that helps. If that compartmentalization starts to break down, it can be incredibly stressful, can lead to wanting to self-medicate, self-soothe, drinking, drugs, what have you. It's one of the things a lot of my criminal defense attorneys talk about, is just being able to unwind at the end of the day. Last bullet here, the lawyers may not be able to discuss this with anyone. It's interesting because in the counseling profession, I recognize, and especially in an inpatient, I recognize that I have the luxury of being able to have the function of supervision, right? And for hopefully everybody out there who's listening understands supervision, engages in supervision in an inpatient setting where we do have teams. I have colleagues, I have a supervisor right down the hallway where I can go and say, hey, look, I'm struggling with this, or this happened and I really need to talk about it, or this is kicking me around, or somebody can walk in my office and say, hey, you look like this is really affecting you. All the helping professions are going to have the experience of the stress. Ours, we are lucky enough to be able to have the mechanism of supervision where attorneys may not have that. They may have a partner that they could go to, a colleague that they can go to, but it is not ingrained in their professional lexicon. It's not ingrained in their professional sort of methodology and how they do things. It's just not necessarily how things are done. Get the job done, put it away, move on to the next job. And so dealing with negative feelings, dealing with the stress, dealing with everything else, last word on this slide, self-medication. That's a big piece of this, obviously a big piece of what I'm dealing with most of my attorneys, how to manage these types of things without turning to chemicals. All right. And as a result of all this, lawyers are a lot more likely to abuse alcohol and substances than most other professions. All right. So let me back this statement up with a little bit of data. So in 2016, there was a study conducted across the United States, just short of 13,000 practicing lawyers. It was put on by the American Bar Association and COLAP, the ABA COLAP, and Hazel and Betty Ford. One of the main authors was a gentleman named Patrick Krill. I want to give Patrick credit where credit is due. He did a great job leading this particular study. He has a follow-up we'll get to in a minute. And the bottom line is that 36% of lawyers self-identify. And I think that's a really important piece to understand. This is self-report. These are the people who are willing to say, yes, I've got a problem. All right. 36% classified as active problem drinkers. Now, take into account that if we take a look at alcoholism rates across the general population, it's what? I don't know, between 12, 15%. Depending on how you're measuring it, depending on, which DSM we're going to use, but we're looking at like 12, 15% versus 36% of self-reporting lawyers. What that doesn't take into account is all the lawyers who said, oh, no, I don't have a problem, which a lot of them probably do. So that 36% is probably kind of low. So when we take a look at this, 36% versus 12.5 to 15%, that's a pretty big difference in percentages in those particular populations, and keeping in mind that 36%, I would guarantee, is fairly low. 19 and 28% were struggling with anxiety and depression. Again, pretty significantly high based on a particular population. All right. So in 2021, I think this came out in May, if my memory serves me right. Patrick Krill and another clinician researcher did a follow-up study. And this follow-up study really focused on attrition due to gender in licensed attorneys. So taking a look at the difference between female attorney attrition versus male attorney attrition. Within this, embedded in this, was looking at high risk and hazardous drinking again. So it's a bit of follow-up data. This is a slightly smaller sample size. This is about 3,000 attorneys from California, Lawyers Association, and the DC Bar. But still, fairly good sample size to look at what are the issues. And we're still looking at 30% of the sample screened positive for high risk and hazardous drinking. Interesting, that second bullet there, second sub bullet, that more women than men screened for high risk hazardous drinking, 34% women versus 25.4% men. I put that in there just as a note of discussion. I don't know that any more than that, point of fact and note of discussion. And then when we take a look at higher attrition rates of female attorneys versus male attorneys, we can start to maybe make some correlations. I did accidentally delete a bullet point here that should be in here when it says by contrast. Well, what are we contrasting? 80% of this 3,000 lawyers, 80% said they drank in the past month. So we're looking at 80% of attorneys being active drinkers in the past month, where by contrast, it's estimated that only 55% of the general population drank in the last month. So again, a fairly big difference when we take a look at some of the numbers. One of the things I thought was interesting in the study, and I noted it here, was that workplace permissiveness towards alcohol was a primary factor in predicting risky drinking. And the reason I put that in there is, I don't know about any of you, but I don't have a bar in my office. Of course, it'd probably be pretty odd. I'm looking at my colleague here, Patty, who's sitting next to me as tech support. And she's like, yeah, it'd be pretty odd. I'm a drug and alcohol counselor and I got a wet bar behind me. I would also find that odd if I go to my physician's office or, even my accountant, I'm not sure. But many law firms have bars in offices. They have conference rooms in larger metropolitan areas. They're going to own a building. Perhaps there's a restaurant in the base of the building that people go to, and that restaurant is going to be, Smith and Walensky, Capitol Grill, shameless plugs here for some of my favorite restaurants that have these amazing steakhouses and bars. And so there's a permissiveness. And as we talked about in the first couple slides with law school, we're looking at a profession where alcohol use is not only allowed, it's encouraged. And so the permissiveness is going to say, look, go ahead, it's all right. Recently worked with a legal assistant who is in a major firm in DC, and I think they called it the garden room. And so when the firm was founded about 100 years ago or 80 years ago, they had this one particular room, and it was the break room, where the break room overlooked this garden, and they just kept wine and beer in there. And 80 years later, they still stock it with wine and beer, and it is free to the employees to go in there, take a break, have a drink, and then get back to work as they want. She also noted that a lot of the associates and a lot of the partners show up to work around 10 o'clock, usually at 10 a.m., usually a little blurry-eyed. Now they'll work till 8, 9 o'clock at night, start drinking throughout the evening, and it's just accepted culture that people will come to work a little bit later. Again, we're coming back to the permissiveness. What is the culture of the firm? What is the culture of the organization around drinking? And so when we're working with attorneys, one of the things I'm very conscientious of is I can pluck somebody out of the environment, we can work with them. What's the environment we put them back into after we're done with them? And if I'm going to take somebody out of this permissive environment, work with them for a month, 2 months, however long they're in treatment, and then they eventually go back into that, do they have the ability and the wherewithal, the coping skills to be in an environment where that permissiveness is prevalent, right? And so some of the work that quite frankly, Karen is doing right now, Karen Treatment Center is doing right now, is working with big law firms on wellness and how to work on some of this permissiveness to change culture, hopefully to reduce some of the risky and problematic drinking. All right, I'm going to bore you with some ethics. Usually I turn this over to my partner, Corey, since he is the attorney and he has to know all this stuff. But I did include it in this presentation just to give you an idea from the legal standpoint, from the American Bar Association standpoint of how they feel about impaired attorneys and what their opinions are. So I'm a little remiss. I can't remember exactly when this ethics opinion was published. When I say relatively recently, past number of years. If anybody wants the exact reference, I can run through my files and see if I can find it and email it out, though I don't know if it's that important. So this is the American Bar Association ethics opinion and three main areas of concern when it comes to impaired attorneys. And that is the obligation of a partner or supervising lawyer really to take steps to be his or her brother's keeper, sister's keeper, to prevent an impaired lawyer from violating rules of professional conduct. And so part of this is making sure that the client is safe, making sure that the attorney is safe, making sure that the firm is safe, right? Because there's not only legal liability, but a significant civil liability if an impaired attorney is working on a case and messes something up. If he or she makes a mistake, that is going to be a violation of the rules of professional conduct, if they're under the influence. And it is the obligation of the supervisor, partner in the firm itself to take steps to prevent that from happening. It also has an area of concern of whether lawyers in the firm have an obligation to inform appropriate professional authority or the impaired and lawyers. Should they be going to the judges and lawyers assistance program? Should we be going to the Bar Association and saying this person is a risk, is a liability to themselves, the firm, and their clients? And the third area of concern is what obligation the lawyers does the firm have if an impaired lawyer leaves the firm? So if I'm the impaired lawyer, I'm working on a case and I leave a firm, what is the firm of, we'll call it Patty, Adam, and Julie, my colleagues who are with me today. What is the obligation of Patty, Julie, and Adam to the clients to say, hey, look, Eric has left the firm, and here are some of the issues that we need to manage. And so all these are very, very sensitive areas that ethics committees and general counsel of law firms need to pay very close attention to for the reasons that I've talked about. Oops, hit the wrong button. All right. So as I mentioned, paramount obligation is to protect the interests of the clients. Part of this may be confronting an impaired lawyer. With Karen, we work with law firms to be able to do this in a constructive way. And we want to and the firm wants to make sure that clients are represented appropriately, notwithstanding the lawyer's impairment. And if there has been mistakes, that they can hopefully correct those and mitigate any damage that may have happened. Again, very, very serious stuff that the firms are dealing with. This is a case also, other steps may include forcefully urging the lawyer to accept assistance. I've had more than one attorney in treatment where the firm has stepped in and said, you're going to go to treatment or there's going to be professional consequences. One of the interesting things, and I may touch on this a little bit later, but I think it's worth noting now, one of the interesting things when attorneys come to treatment, it's usually based on professional unmanageability. Personal unmanageability, family unmanageability, medical unmanageability, all those things may be piling up. And if work is going well, the attorney says, look, as long as work's okay, I'm okay. Don't worry about it. We're all a bunch of drinkers. So that's just the way it goes. But when the firm steps in and says, no, we're noticing impairment, we're noticing you need to go, that's usually the final step to get a legal professional into treatment, is when there is professional consequences on the chopping block. So the impairment raises a substantial question as to fitness. Um, Lawyers do have an obligation to report impairment, and I won't bore you with the certain rules. And again, consider consulting mental health or lawyers assistance program. We've chatted about this a bit. All right. So now I've bored you with the ethics. Let's talk a little bit about working with legal professionals. Um, One of the things I find important when I'm working with attorneys is really having an outright conversation of the training of law school. And I'll ask attorneys, how did you do in law school, and did you like law school? What was your experience of law school? And a lot of my attorneys will say, I really liked law school. I liked the Socratic method. I liked the learning. I liked the reading. I liked the research. I liked the writing. I liked this and that. So understanding how law school affects an attorney's thinking, the way they view the world, the way they interact with other people, whether it's attorneys or anybody else, right? And one of the big things that I like to discuss is the Socratic method. And if you're familiar with Socratic method, great. If you're not, the short version is it's about asking questions to lead to a certain conclusion. And I have this is actually a note to myself, proving that the grass is not green, right? And through Socratic method, I could argue that the grass is not green. And so that might look like, and I'm going to use Patty, who's sitting next to me, just to help my cause here. Mm-hmm. And I'll say to Patty, what is your understanding of green? And, she may or may not come up with an answer. And I'll say, well, how sure are you that your understanding of green is my understanding of green? And can you prove that? She's like, well, maybe not. I don't see through your eyes or through your lenses. I said, okay. So could it be considered that the green is actually my blue? Well, quite possibly. Well, if my green is actually a blue and your green is a green or even a purple, maybe, can we argue that the grass really isn't objectively green, that it might be subjectively to some people, that it could be blue? Well, Eric, that is possible. And so we're basically arguing the fact that the grass is not green. Now, I can argue that from a physiological standpoint, in that the grass isn't any particular color. It simply bounces a wavelength off of a wavelength of light into my eye, and my eye has a receptor, and my brain creates green. So the grass is not really green. My brain creates green. Right? Patty's over here looking at me like I'm, oh man, the grass isn't green. I've just convinced her. She's gonna go home and tell her significant other about this. Be like, this guy's nuts. Why do I go down this rabbit hole? Because as you're sitting and trying to make sense or a logical argument with an attorney, they may be arguing with you at least in their head in the Socratic method. And that's you don't necessarily want to get into that argument. You want to talk about the argument. I want to talk about the Socratic method. I want to talk about the way that they're going to argue with me, hopefully to mitigate that argument and stop it before it gets out of control or it gets down a rabbit hole that they're going to, out argue me and be like, oh yeah, alcohol's great for you. Fantastic. Have another drink. But understanding that and putting that out there can be very, very helpful to sort of stop that at the start. And getting into analysis and logical argument. Again, most of my attorneys, this is what they do for a living. So I may or may not want to engage in that. When we talk about meeting them where they're at. I mean, that's a buzz phrase for our profession. And meeting them where they're at with this group does mean a certain amount of analysis, a certain amount of logic, and then helping them move hopefully from their head to their heart, as we say in treatment, or wherever they need to go. But I think it's important that we understand where our attorneys are coming from and not expect them to be somewhere where they're not. Yes, some attorneys are going to come in, they're going to be emotional, they're going to be emotionally intelligent, they're going to be insightful, they may have some good emotional connectedness, they may have some insight, and I don't want to discount that. But that's probably not the bulk of the attorneys that I'm working with. And so I need to be okay with starting with a little more of the intellectual and then hopefully moving a little more towards the emotional as we progress in the treatment process. All right. What makes them different? I think I've spent a lot of time on this. I'll skip that particular one. How to approach uniqueness without inflating ego. And this is a difficult one because, I don't want to say all attorneys are egomaniacs. A lot of them actually are very self-conscious and can be quite humble. One of the things I'll tell my attorneys is, look, here's the deal. who goes to law school? You know, they don't let dumb people into law school. You got to be relatively intelligent to get into, pass the LSATs and get into school reasonably. Passing law school, I mean, getting through the 3 or 4 years, however long it takes you, and then taking the bar. That makes this group a fairly bright group. So let's not deny that. And let's take a look at everything that law school teaches you. And the fact is, you're going to have one of the most difficult times dealing with step one, because paralysis and unmanageability is for the other person, right? Losing is for the other person. And so I will both insult and compliment my attorneys at the same time and say, you're some of the brightest folks who have the most difficulty with step one. But once you get it, a lot of times you get it. So there's the hope throughout that. And when I joke about that, make that joke, a lot of times we can appreciate the uniqueness without inflating the ego, giving them due diligence, if you will, to what they've gone through, and yet they know they're going to have some struggles in the recovery process. All right. So some more ideas. This one, I think the top one here, realistic work-life balance. That's a difficult one. And I think a lot of it depends on the nature of the legal professional. You know, if I'm working with a judge and the judge says, look, you know, I work during courtroom hours, I might work some later evenings just doing case review or so on and so forth, but reasonable work-life hours or work-life balance with certain areas of law. Other areas of law, work-life balance is going to look really out of whack, right? And so, here we go. You know, what is the difference between hard work and workaholism? The fact is, if you know an attorney, if you are an attorney, if you have a family member who's an attorney, somebody who goes through law school and gets into the practice of law, especially in big law, your first, second, third, fourth year associates are not working 40 hours a week and then going home. That's just not happening. First, second, third, fifth year associates are working very long hours, typically 80 to 100 hours a week. And that's not an exaggeration, especially if they're in a very busy work group. If they're doing mergers and acquisitions where they're working on deadlines, and if it's an international firm and they're dealing with other time zones and other areas of the world, if they're doing deals with somebody, say, over in the Middle East or somebody over in Asia, it's a 12 to 14-hour time difference, and they're expected to be on a conference call at 2 a.m., that's the expectation. You're going to be on a conference call at 2 a.m. And so as we're working with that balance, I think it's understanding that balance isn't 50-50. Balance is having enough solid recovery focus. And then, you know, somebody said, you know, if I put 10% of my day focused on my recovery, I can spend the other 90% doing what I need to do in my life. And if that's work, that's work. If it's family, it's family. So it doesn't have to be 50% of this, 50% of that, but rather really focusing on that 10% is not, it's not, you can't violate that. That is sex, it's sacred. You can't mess with it. That 10%, if that's what you need, is absolutely necessary in order for the rest of the 90% to be there and function. So when I'm working with a legal professional, I want to take a realistic look at what their professional needs are. And the fact is, we may need to adjust those. I've coached many attorneys to say, look, you're going back to work, you're going back 70%. You're going to take a 30% cut in pay, 30% cut in hours so that you can make time for your recovery. And that might be the balance for the first couple of 3-6 months. And a lot of firms will do that with attorneys. Some of that depends on whether they're associates, partners, senior managing partners, what have you. So there's, you know, some negotiation within that. But realistic, what is the work-life balance for a legal professional? It's typically not a 40-hour week. If somebody's a sole practitioner, they're not only representing clients, doing work, they're also trying to drum up new business. They're calling people back. They're working into the evenings. Again, helping somebody figure out that can be a big part of what we need to do. I want to spend some time on burnout, something probably a lot of us are familiar with. When I was looking into burnout and how to really give it some concrete definition, I thought this was sort of interesting, that the 3 dimensions are exhaustion, depersonalization, and inefficiency. And when I took a look at these 3 words, thought, Yeah, folks were getting burned out even within my own profession years ago when I was a director and a supervisor and I had staff. I could point out some of these things that was happening as staff are starting to happen, where I could say, take some time. You need to regroup because we see early signs of burnout. This obviously can happen in any profession, but especially high stress professions. And so as we're looking to help our attorneys, our legal professionals, asking about exhaustion, asking about the cynicism or the distant attitude towards work, and what the efficiency or inefficiency looks like. So we might say, look, take more time off, or you really need to ratchet back, or you need to take a left turn and maybe do something else. So we want to pay attention to these dimensions of burnout. So I'm going to spend a little time on resilience, and that should take a couple of minutes. And then, Adam, I think we have some question answers. I'll turn that back over to you then. So just a couple of notes on resilience. And I'll say this, when my partner, Corey, and I present for various bar associations, we've presented for DC, Virginia, Maryland, Florida, Arkansas. The great thing about Zoom is I don't have to go to Arkansas. I can just do it from here. One of the number one things that they wanted to talk about in the past year and a half, especially through the pandemic, is this idea of resilience. Like, how do we survive this? And especially in high stress, high pressure professions. And this would really apply to our medical professionals who've struggled so much through the pandemic. It's just been such a hard profession to be in. When I take a look at it specifically for legal professionals, the fact is that if folks are in it for more than a paycheck, that they see how their work has value and impact, and that is reflected back, and it might need to be reflected back in many ways and in many times, that you're doing this and it has value. Yes, the paycheck is nice, but there's something at the end of the day. I'm looking at a question here: growing need for recovery coaches, companions for attorneys. I would say yes. Like the wellness departments in big law firms are looking at this to be able to give people the ability to build more resilience. So that's a great question. Developing and maintaining high quality relationships. I've sort of danced around this a bit, but one of the things we know about resilient people is that they have a good network and they have a good support system. I mean, for anybody who's familiar with the recovery process, what's the most important part of the recovery process besides not picking up is having a support system. If the nature of addiction is complete isolation and being alone, the nature of recovery is really being connected to other people and not feeling alone, right? Not feeling lonely. I can be alone, but not be lonely at all. I know people are out there, they care about me, and I've got great support. So the high quality relationships are incredibly important. And I really stress this with my legal professionals, with my attorneys, to say, look, who can you really spend some time with? And if it's just a good sit and bitch session, well, you just need that. Just make sure that it's somebody you feel really safe with. All right. Using stress as an opportunity to connect, and really to push yourself closer to resilience and reach out to others. And so rather than using stress as a reason to withdraw and self-medicate, using reason as the opportunity to say, look, I'm going to reach out, connect, and really use these relationships to bolster myself. And as noted here, something counterintuitive to most lawyers and lots of other people as well. Lawyers are not unique in there. All right. Flexibility to adapt to challenges, adversity, changing life circumstances. There's a great quote by a woman named Amy Mullins. She was doing a TED talk maybe about 11 or 12 years ago. It's been a while. And she quotes Darwin, and she says, Darwin, summarizing, it's not the most intelligent or the strongest that survive. It's the most adaptable. It's the person who, and the being who adapts, that is most likely to survive any given situation. I thought that was really sort of interesting to note. Being motivated to achieve in different areas of life so you can spread out that sense of value, that sense of, well-being, and that sense of being connected to other people. All right. Talked about this a little before, career counseling, because sometimes change is necessary. I was just talking with an attorney. He is in-house counsel for a startup. And he's like, Eric, I just want to teach. And I'm not talking law school. He goes, I want to teach high schoolers. I want to career counsel high schoolers on whether they should or shouldn't get into law. Because if I knew what I knew now, I probably would never would have gone to law school. And I thought it was such an interesting comment. And so part of my work with this particular gentleman right now is taking a look at how over time he might be able to pivot to make himself really feel good about his professional career and be happy. And so there are times when we end up doing a bit of career counseling, and whether that's how to survive, it's kind of a tough word, adapt to the environment that they're in to be successful in the recovery, or to pivot, take a slight left or take a hard left to get off the highway and go do something completely different. I always counsel that we don't make any quick decisions, especially very early in recovery. No really significant decisions unless absolutely necessary for your recovery. But we want to start this early on because we don't want people to feel stuck. Many legal professionals, many attorneys feel stuck in a rut of what they're doing, and that can be really downtrod somebody's spirit. It can be really spiritually crushing. And we want to give folks hope that there are options. Let's just put stuff out on the table. So it can be incredibly important. And I'll say this, I know so many people who, if we say, no, you have options. I do. Well, if I have options, that actually makes it easier to stay. Just because I know I'm not stuck, it's my choice to be here. And spiritually, that's just more uplifting. All right. I was asked to put some considerations when picking a program for recovery for legal professionals, looking for folks that they can relate to, treatment with peers or other professionals. For some folks, the ability to work while in treatment. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's not good. A lot of times that needs to be negotiated beforehand. But for some folks, it can make the entry into treatment possible if they say, look, I just need like a half an hour a day to check emails to make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks. If that's what they need, and that's preventing them from coming in, I'm a proponent of let's work with it. It's all fodder for clinical conversation. Let's see what we need. Treating the firm as family. I recently had a patient where we didn't do the family work with his wife. They were okay. We did the family work with the firm because that's who he spends most of his time with. Lastly, making sure realistic aftercare when somebody transitions back, that they're not going back to 100 hours a week. But I also tell them, don't necessarily take 2 months off because you go absolutely stir crazy. That's not necessarily good for somebody. But finding realistic aftercare and setting up realistic plans for somebody once they do hit the real world again. My clock says 12:52. So Adam, I want to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Eric, and wonderful job. We will now move to the Q&A portion of the presentation, and we've received a lot of great questions, and we are going to answer some that were submitted through the registration process. And if we have time, we are going to answer some questions that came through during the presentation. If we don't have time to get to your question, we are going to follow up with you afterwards with an answer. So the first 2 questions, I believe you answered regarding how does treatment differ for attorneys and how do we break through the terminal uniqueness and or resistance to treatment that attorneys have. So maybe touch on that again, but I have an addition to that. What about the challenges of attorneys re-entering the workplace now in recovery and maybe concerns about being open with their colleagues about that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that last piece is very individualized. And I'll tell any of my professionals that, attorneys or any other professional in the business that I'm working with, self-disclosure in the professional realm is very individualized. Some folks, it really is a benefit for them to go back and say, hey, I've been to treatment, I'm in recovery, and this is the changes you're going to see. Oh, by the way, it's my name on the law firm, and I'm changing culture. For other folks, a little more discretion, to be a little more discreet, a little more private might be important to professional security, professional reputation. It just might take a little time for them to self-disclose when appropriate. My general counsel, my overall counsel to people is disclose when it's a benefit to you and your recovery. Other than that, this is professional world. It's really not necessary. If somebody asks me how I'm doing, I don't tell them what my blood pressure is. I just tell them I'm feeling well. Thank you very much. That my blood pressure numbers are really none of their business. In fact, they just went up when you asked me that. No, I'm just kidding. So same thing about recovery. If it's germane to the conversation, to the relationship, to the benefit of somebody in recovery, yes, we can do a very discreet and professional self-disclosure. But other than that, I don't actually recommend people go back necessarily wave the flag. I will tell one quick story because I just think it's funny. I had a gentleman in treatment who owned his own company. He had about 200 employees, and he would throw the most unbelievable Christmas parties. I'm talking elephants, professional wrestlers, and tons of cocaine and booze, just crazy parties. And so he comes to treatment and he's taking this seriously. And he says, and we're in a group, he says, it occurs to me, I have to tell my employees, because I'm not getting the elephants, professional wrestlers, monkeys, and 3 mountains of cocaine for Christmas. It's going to get toned down a little bit this year. We're just going to stick to the elephants and the professional wrestlers. The other stuff we're not doing. And everybody got a chuckle at the joke. But the fact is, he was setting the tone for culture. And it was important for him to reset the tone, to change that tone. And so in that case, he was going to walk in and tell everybody, I was at Karen, I'm in recovery, and we're changing. If you don't like it, go to the competitor down the road. So a funny story, but I think it gives the point of sometimes self-disclosure is important. Other times we want to just be a little more discreet.
Thank you. The next question aligns a bit with the first, but would you discuss a little bit more about the importance of peer support for attorneys in recovery? And then I got a very kind of specific question about location, like peer support for attorneys in Kentucky or Tennessee or Nashville. So I'm thinking maybe just generally, could you talk a little bit about the supports available both nationally and regionally for attorneys?
Sure, certainly. So every state has a lawyer's assistance program. They're going to go by different names. In Pennsylvania, it's Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. South Carolina, it's Lawyers Helping Lawyers. For many states, it's JLAP, Judges and Lawyers Assistance Programs. There's going to be slight variations on the articulation on the language. But every state has an assistance program. It is funded by the bar, but there is no reporting back to the bar. It can act as a buffer between an attorney and the bar as far as licensing goes. And even if there's legal issues, if somebody has, a professional complaint against them, or they've gotten an arrest like a DUI, and the courts are going to step in and the bar association is going to step in. I will speak to a couple of states I'm very familiar with. South Carolina, Michigan are two that offer monitoring programs and will really work with the attorney as an advocate and a monitor and a support, and connect them with other attorneys in recovery. A lot of times attorneys in recovery who are affiliated with the assistance programs, they'll make themselves available. Hey, if somebody's coming out of treatment, give me a call. We'll go to some meetings. There are some lawyer-specific meetings in certain areas. To find out if there's something in your area, simply call the state bar, the state lawyers assistance program. Go online. Everybody's on the internet at this point, and look your specific state up to see what the services are. And I've interacted with lots of assistance programs, by and large, and I must say, just about every single one of them, if not all of them, have been exceptionally helpful. Really, really friendly, very open, and just really, really willing to help. That's what they're there for.
Thank you. And thank you, Anne, for sharing some of links to some of those resources in the chat. So we are coming to the end of our time. Again, if we didn't get to your question, we are going to follow up with you. So keep an eye on your email. And I just want to thank you again, Eric, for your informative presentation. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. As a reminder, this presentation is eligible for 1 continuing education credit. So watch your email for a link from cego.com to complete your evaluation. Karen has several more exciting webinars in the works. On March 9th, we will be presenting a webinar entitled Navigating the Continuum of Care, in which one CE credit will be awarded. It will run from noon until 1 p.m. and will be presented by Eric Rodriguez, the Educational Resource Director at Cairn. Then on March 23rd, join us for a webinar entitled Mutual Support in Recovery, an Evolving Landscape. This will be presented by Reverend Jack Abel, who is the Senior Director of Spiritual Care at Cairn. One CE credit will also be awarded for this webinar, and it will again be at noon. Please visit us at cairn.org/webinars for more information and to register. Also, please keep an eye out for an email from us with more details. In the meantime, please reach out to your local regional resource director for additional information, resources in your area, or questions regarding admission to any of Cairn's programs. Again, thank you all for joining us and have a great afternoon.
Okay.
All right. See you. Bye, everybody.